So let's talk more about standard American English versus non-standard US English dialects. Okay, so the question is, where did standard American English come from? How did it become known as the standard? And if we think back to the 60s, television became a very important medium, and it solidified the dialect that has today become accepted as the dialect that we speak in schools, in formal contexts, in professional contexts, and basically the network standard dialect, the dialect that was used on television, was a generalized Midwestern dialect. And so this is what sort of formed the kind of English that was admired, that began to be more admired, and that was seen by society as more privileged than any other. Before the incidence of television, there really wasn't any sort of medium where people across the nation of the United States were hearing each other and being able to contrast and compare how each spoke, right? So there wasn't really ideas of hierarchy between different dialects as of yet. But when television came around, they had to choose one representation, one dialect that they were going to show on TV, that program on TV would be broadcast across the country, and this is how it became associated as privilege, especially because it was associated as with the television program. Also keep in mind that obviously those who would be on television in the 1960s were primarily white, and so it was a dialect that was connected to white people. Something very important to keep in mind in terms of racism, okay, and prejudice. The famous news anchor Walter Cronkite, if you've heard of him, he is a really good example of a broadcaster using this Midwestern generalized dialect that was chosen. And I want to show you a sample of his speech and his talking. You can probably recognize that it sounds very similar to what the standard American English dialect sounds like today, and that's the point. So his dialect, the area in which he was from, his dialect was chosen as the marker for the standard American English.
February 20th, 1981, a day that began as the 444th day of captivity and ended as the first day of freedom for the American hostages in Iran.
Number 9, the 3 Mile Island Incident.
Good evening. The world has never known a day quite like today.
Fear from the Cold War was still...
Okay, so you can hear that Walter Cronkite sounds very similar to the standard American English that we are familiar with today, and through television, it took on a form of prestige and created a hierarchy of importance and power between that dialect, the standard American English today, and others that differed from it. Okay, so we're going to go over some non-standard US English dialects, and I've divided them into two groups. The first being English-derived dialects, and these are things like the dialect from New England, the Southern US dialect, the English dialect in metropolitan New York, and the Appalachian English. Okay, these are all different dialects. There are also English-derived dialects with some foreign language influences. So the differences that you hear grammatically actually come from influences of other languages, because the communities that learned English were actually immigrants that had come with other languages. So we see things like Yiddish-influenced English being spoken in New York, Italian-influenced English again in New York, Pennsylvania Dutch English was influenced by German, Cajun English was influenced by French, Chicano English by Spanish, and then we have the dialect Black English Vernacular or African American English Vernacular, and that was actually influenced by a number of West African languages. So let me show you a map of where these different dialects are being spoken. This map actually shows you how the dialects are broken up across the US. So you'll notice that there's actually geographical differences between where these different dialects are spoken. So the dialectal borders are created by geography, such as the Connecticut River dividing East and West New England accents. There's also a political difference. You'll see that the South is grouped together and is differentiated from the North. We can talk about that politically in the fact that the rivalry between the North and the South United States partitioned the two, and people actually speak very differently in those two different regions, and that's because of the politics of our history around that. And then historically, we can also see that California, part of California, but the west side of the country is seen as different to the east side, which is then broken up in other ways. But the reason why this is its own portion is because of history, because of the Great Migration to the west, and the effects that new region and the emergence of different dialects of people who were coming from the east had on the dialects. And so together they actually formed a separate dialect than what we can find in the east. So again, here are just the New England area, the Mid-Atlantic, the North, the Midland, the West, and then the South. Okay, so the South is considered this piece here. Do you notice how, actually in Florida, and obviously including South Florida, is not included in any of these dialect boundaries in the United States? So if you think about why, you can think about the fact that South Florida has a lot of immigrants coming from South America, from the Caribbean. It also has a lot of movement from the north. People from New Jersey, New York, and other states up north tend to move to Florida for retirement. So there's a lot of shift and change in the people who come to South Florida and reside in South Florida. And so actually, in terms of studies haven't included Florida in those maps because the dialects keep sort of shifting. If you go on YouTube or if you Google Miami dialect, you'll actually get some pretty interesting videos of people who have started to notice that Miami is picking up a sort of dialect of its own that is influenced by Spanish. And that's something really interesting to keep your eye on that might affect how dialect boundaries are drawn up in the future. So now I want to show you some of the immigrant language influenced US English dialects. We have Pennsylvania Dutch German, and this is the influenced by German, as I had told you before. And the German immigrants brought High German, which actually became called Dutch in the US because of a misnomer. Because German, the name for German in German is Deutsch. The Americans at the time heard it and misnamed it Dutch, and so that's why it's called Pennsylvania Dutch, but it has nothing to do with the Dutch language. It's actually influenced by German. And so here's an example. Again, it's spoken in Pennsylvania, also in parts of Ohio. Here's an example. They would say, "There's cake back yet," which means there is more cake to come. Okay, so here you see a difference syntactically, because back is sort of put in a different position. Also, it would be lexically, because back is used to represent more, right? So here you see both syntactical and lexical differences between the Pennsylvania Dutch dialect and the standard American English dialect, where we would say there is more cake to come. Cajun English is, again, as I said, influenced by French. This is spoken in southern Louisiana and in some parts of eastern Texas. And Cajun English is significantly influenced by Cajun French, which was the historical language of the Cajun people. And it's a direct descendant of Acadian French, which is not the same as the French that is spoken in Paris. So the Acadian French is actually from a different part of France, and so it has a different, it's actually a different dialect of French in and of itself, and not the French that we think about when we take French in high school. So the Acadian French is what influenced the English of the people that lived in these areas. And so an example of that dialect would be something like making groceries. And this comes from the French faire des grosseries. So we would say, you know, shopping for groceries or something like that. But what they've done is they've translated that faire, which means to make, and they have made it into the verb, making groceries. And so you can see here that this would be a lexical difference. Okay, not syntactical, because it's actually the word order is the same as standard American English. We would say doing groceries. Okay, but the fact that they have connected make as a type of verb for groceries, that would be the lexical difference. Okay, the next one is Chicano English, influenced by Spanish, and it's a dialect of U.S. English that is spoken by Chicanos. It's mainly used by Mexican Americans in California, and you can see that I've pointed it out for you, and also in the Southwest. Okay, in this area right here. But just keep in mind that not all Mexican Americans identify themselves as Chicano. I think it is very particular to those regions, and also there's a particular cultural identity and cultural community that refer to themselves as Chicanos. And as you can imagine, it originated when immigrants from Mexico settled in these areas. Also when Mexicans that were living in these areas, that territory was then bought out by the U.S. Okay, so here's an example. She didn't tell me nothing about that. Okay, so somebody who has not studied dialects before, or who has studied dialectal differences, is going to look at that sentence and think, oh, that's wrong, right? That's incorrect. That's grammatically wrong. But it's not. It's not at all. In fact, it's systematic. It's rule governed. It's just different from the standard American English version. Okay, so the fact that there's two negatives there, she didn't, and then nothing, that actually comes from a translation of Spanish, where it would be ella no me dijo nada sobre eso. So it's literally, she didn't tell me nothing about that. And it is rule governed. There is a rule that dictates how, in Chicano English and even in Spanish, we use double negatives. Okay? Again, it's different to the standard American English, which would be, she didn't tell me anything about that, and that anything takes away that double negative. But that's the rule for the standard American English dialect, different to the Chicano English dialect. Okay? Not incorrect. It's not incorrect. Okay, and then the last one is Yiddish-influenced English. This comes from metropolitan New York. And this would be, an example of this would be Esto she saw, or a dozen knishes you bought. And so here you can see the difference here is syntactical, right? So it would be she saw Esther, right? Subject, verb, object. She saw Esther. But instead, they actually have a different word order in the languages coming from Poland and Russia, where Yiddish would be spoken by Jewish people. And instead, they would put the object first, Esther, and then she saw would be next. So object, subject, verb. Okay, the same thing. A dozen knishes you bought. In standard American English, we would say you bought a dozen knishes. But instead, in these Yiddish-influenced English, the word order mimics the Yiddish language, and so it would be object, a dozen knishes, subject, verb, you bought. And so the difference here between Yiddish-influenced English and standard American English is syntactical in this case.